Now, David, good evening and welcome.
Good evening and thank you.
Should we be scared of 2007, a repeat of 2007?
Absolutely, because even before the announcement of the new election date, there has been a great deal of risks in Kenya, which is a holdover from the 2007 elections. As the year progressed from early last year, there has been a lot of progress involving 4 Kenyans who were being investigated by the International Criminal Court over the post-election violence. And beginning last year, rather from early last year, the 4 suspects, initially there were 6, they went to the ICC, and then by early this year they had been indicted already, and it's expected that the trial might begin before the end of this year.
Yeah.
And many of them are holding immense political weight in the country, and they are insisting that they are going to be on the ballot, despite the fact that they are going to be indicted for, they have been indicted for high crimes.
Yeah, I suppose it's always difficult forecasting these things. So what's your call and what's your take for the elections that we've now been told will be held in 2013, when the expectation was that actually these elections might actually be held this year?
Even though the Electoral Commission has announced an election for March next year, it's still not clear whether that date will be honored, because the overwhelming majority of the population in Kenya are opposed to that date. A good deal of members of parliament and civil society are also opposed to it. There's still a case pending in court appealing a decision that the Electoral Commission depended on to bring this date, and that appeal might succeed and actually bring the election forward to either April or December. At the same time, the 2 principals, which is the president and the prime minister, could still agree on an earlier date. At the same time, members of parliament could still amend the constitution if they get a majority of 65% and bring the election forward. So it's still not very clear whether that date will be honored.
Yeah. How real, though, is the prospect of these parliamentarians being able to gather the 65% that's required to change the constitution?
It's unrealistic, because most of the MPs, even though they appreciate that the public is not happy with this date, are actually after self-interest, because they know the longer they stay in power, the better for them, because opinion polls show that most of them will not be re-elected, so they won't mind staying in parliament for a longer time. So that option of going for an amendment is not very realistic. The only realistic opportunity remaining is the court process, if the Court of Appeal rejects the new date as presented by the Electoral Commission. Yeah.
Now, earlier on, I was speaking to a stockbroker from Nairobi, and we talked about the fact that the market has been under pressure for the past week, and some are beginning to read into that weakness, the fact that you have got politicians and business people beginning to look at that election and beginning to think perhaps this is the time to start taking your money off the table. What kind of an impact do you see? First, let's look at the markets, and then secondly, on the economy in general.
I think most people who wish to invest in Kenya at the moment are going to take a break, or they're going to hold a wait and to adopt a wait and see attitude, because normally Kenya elections tend to affect all the landlocked countries around Kenya and beyond, as we saw during the last election when actually the economy of the region was shut down because of Kenya is actually the gateway to most of this region. So I think the investment climate is not very real at the moment, given that there are actually risks of violence as we approach the election and even beyond.
Right. What about on the economy in general?
The economy has already been battered by the kind of attitude we had last year, whereby the shilling was depreciating at a very record rate last year, partly due to the effects of the post-election violence of 2007, where the economy is really never recovered. And then the current the current account deficit has never narrowed. It continues to expand, given that structurally the economy has never expanded to actually reduce the gap between what we import and what we export. And as we saw last year, when Kenya was going towards the indictment of the 4 suspects, the stock exchange in Nairobi was actually crashing. Many people from the West were divesting, and inflation went high, despite the measures that the Central Bank of Kenya tried to imposed to reduce the pressures.
Yeah.
So there's no likelihood of these things improving in the last 5 months towards the election. They might even accelerate.
Yeah. Now, let's look at inside the country itself. Who are likely to be the winners if an election were held as scheduled next year in March? Now, we know, of course, Kenya is one of those African countries where you have this situation where the winners and the losers have been forced to form a coalition government that is governed.
Right now, it's very difficult to predict who will be the president. That's one of the risks that are facing this election. If it was a straightforward matter, many investors would be able to predict, perhaps after December or after March, I'll be able to come back and invest. But there's no likelihood that we are even going to conclude this election during the first round. We might have a second round going into June, which means the climate of uncertainty will actually expand up to June in the event that, in the likely event that we're not going to have a winner during the first round. One reason is because most of the political parties are actually split between several factions, and beyond that, there's a likelihood that violence may actually accompany the build-up to the election. So it's not very clear up to now to predict who will win, and that's part of the fear that investors are actually looking at.
Yeah, David, let's talk about a sensitive issue here. Let's talk about the issue of ethnicity. How big a role do you see it playing in these elections? We saw it in 2007, and there have been attempts to make sure that this is covered and doesn't become an issue again going forward. What do you see?
Ethnicity will always play a role in politics of Kenya and many African countries where political socialization is along tribal or sectarian lines. If you look at the crisis we are having in Kenya right now, coming from the 2007 election, it was actually a tribal conflict because despite the dispute over the results, there was also an outbreak of political violence, but which took a tribal line. And up to now, despite or in spite of all the efforts that have been done in terms of justice, we still have a lot of things that are yet to be done. We have got people who have yet to be resettled from the violence, and the communities still remain divided despite the fact that the government claims to be engaging in reconciliation. At the same time, most of the alliances that are being formed to compete or to return power actually along ethnic lines.
Right.
We have got people from regions, different regions and different areas trying to form alliances. So it remains a fact that political socialization in Kenya is along political lines. I mean, tribal lines.
Absolutely. It is an unfortunate development in Africa. David Ochami, independent senior parliamentary analyst, thank you for joining us live from our studios in Nairobi.